Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joel Mitchell. How are you today, Joel?
I'm all right, Jason. I was feeling a little bit dodgy late yesterday, so I went and got a PCR test, but I got my negative text this morning, so I'm all good.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. We did have a team member who will remain anonymous who did contract COVID recently.
Yes, an anonymous team member in our group of 7 office mates.
Yes, but for confidentiality reasons, we cannot.
We don't know who that is.
No. But yes, glad that you had the PCR test, which is more accurate than the rat. So,
yes. All good. So probably just a little bit of a cold.
Yeah, now that's going around as well. But you're caffeine up for today?
I am. Yes, I've had my caffeine. I've had my breakfast. I'm ready to go.
All right, sweet. Well, we should introduce our guest then.
Yes.
Okay, so he has spent close to 20 years working with trade unions to represent their members across a range of hazardous industries. He is currently responsible for OHS and workers' compensation matters at the Australian Council of Trade Unions as the Assistant Secretary and Director of the Centre for Work Health and Safety. Welcome to the podcast, Liam O'Brien.
Thanks for having me.
No, really great to have you on, mate. We were saying off air that you're the second unionist to actually be on after Jake Field from MUA. So really great to have you on to talk about what you guys are doing and how you're supporting your members in this area.
Yeah, well, big shoes to fill following Jake, and he's a great campaigner around health and safety, in particular around mental health in our sort of offshore and maritime sectors. So really great to be here.
Terrific.
So Liam, softball question before we get started. Do you have any podcasts that you like to listen to?
Well, as I was saying to you off air, podcast was a thing that I used to do a lot of because, pre-COVID, used to travel a lot, find myself on planes a lot, and listening to podcasts was a really good way of doing it. But they were also, I'm a union official, highly interested in politics and particularly interested in US politics. And I found myself sort of going in these waves of listening to podcasts, and it generally always coincided with sort of midterm elections in the US or presidential elections. So actually, it's been the better part of a year and a half before I've been sort of, religiously listening to podcasts. But I do listen to a few. One of my favorite US political podcasts is Pod Save America, which is a really good podcast about, what's going on in politics in the US. But I'm also a bit of a cycling nut and like my cycling. So another podcast that I listen to is The Move, which is controversially Lance Armstrong's podcast. So it's a good podcast. It talks a lot about road racing and some of the key issues going on there. And I really enjoy that. And then there's a few in Australia that I listen to. One favorite of mine is The Week on Wednesday, which is a good political podcast that everybody should be listening to, especially in the middle of a federal election.
I don't enjoy election time, I have to say.
Yeah, no, I try and keep away from the news at the best of times, let alone in an election.
Yeah, I just keep seeing that raw chicken korma.
Yeah, that was pretty great.
Just living in my brain.
Yeah,
rent free.
Thanks for sharing that.
Well, I had to share it with somebody.
Yeah, that was pretty wrong, and I got to say, I'm really looking for news about what happened to those that ate it, just to confirm that they were okay.
Yeah. There's sort of part of me that goes, was it like deliberately staged just to get more sort of coverage? There's all of that sort of stunt taking that happens during elections.
Yeah, like eating onions, eating the democracy sausage the wrong way.
Yeah, the hot dog sideways. Yeah, all of that kind of stuff.
The stunts seem to have gotten a lot worse this time around. I don't recall it being such a feature of elections, but these sort of made for TV news moments seem to be a real feature of this election campaign.
Yeah, just whatever. I mean, there's so much going on in the world, I guess. So to sort of stand out from the noise, maybe you just got to step it up and be a bit more ridiculous.
Yeah, but I do love it now.
Where does that take you? What's next?
Well, yeah, is it? Yeah, indeed. We'll see.
I love it though. If you go on Google, right, and you go to search and you say Tony Abbott, and the first suggestion will be onion,
Yeah.
Bill Shorten sausage.
Yeah,
Forget about all of their policies and everything else. It's like, that's what they're remembered for.
Didn't even take the skin off.
Yeah, it'll be Scott Morrison salmonella.
Yeah.
I haven't checked that one out.
It could be worse, I guess, couldn't it?
Yeah. We'll have to put a link in the show notes now to the chicken korma.
Yeah, for our international listeners who don't know what on earth we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. Can you tell us about your professional career, Liam?
Well, as Jason said, it's sort of coming up on 20 years that I've been an official in the trade union movement. I started quite young. I was 21 when I started working for the Australian Workers Union here in Victoria. And the AWU, for those that maybe aren't familiar, is quite a diverse union. So when I started, I was organising chicken farmers and people collecting eggs in hatcheries and chicken farms. And throughout my career there, which sort of spans 15 years, I organised everything from sort of, as I said, pastoral and agricultural workers right through to heavy manufacturing, so steel, glass, aluminium. Spent a bit of time over in Western Australia as a national official organising in the aluminium industry, where you've got some significant refineries and mines over there. So it really gave me this sort of well-rounded understanding of not just Australian industry, but what work is and the different types of work that people are engaged in. And I think for me in particular, health and safety was front and center. Obviously, it was a range of industries which really physical hazards dominated. There were many instances across my career there where dealing with not just injured workers, but indeed workplaces where workers were killed was not an uncommon feature of the work of a lot of AWU officials. And so having a real appreciation of that sort of fundamental human right to safe and healthy work was something that was ingrained in me very early on in my sort of working career there. And I think something that increased over the last 20 years has been my awareness of psychological health and the impact that work has on it, both positively, but indeed negatively. And I think greater awareness around mental health has definitely contributed to it. But equally, I think the changing nature of work has also meant that we're seeing significant more pressures placed on workers' psychological health as to what we might have seen 20 or even 40 years ago when it comes to their physical health. And that even in those industries that I described, the sort of work intensification is bearing out much more on workers' psychological health, as we've been really successful at reducing the rate of injury in the physical space. So, my working career has very much had as a sort of, fundamental focus, ensuring workers have a right to safe and healthy work. And I think, the next frontier, or the frontier that we're sort of right in the middle of sort of combating, is that workplace mental health stuff.
Yeah, so I think probably one of the big things that I've seen is, along with the intensification, is also sort of increasing in insecure work, so people just being brought on short-term contracts and the gig economy and all of that sort of thing. So I think that's also having a compounding effect on mental health, because that, secure work is sort of one of those fundamental things that you need, to be able to just feel comfortable in your life and know that you can pay the bills and you can rent or buy a house or whatever it is that you need to do, and you can feed your family and all of that sort of thing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, secure work is and has always been associated with higher levels of injury and illness at work. There's significant research now that confirms this. And there's a few fundamental reasons about this, but also in particular about how it impacts on workers' psychological health. The first thing I'd say about insecure work, which sort of relates to health and safety more broadly, is that, it fundamentally impacts workers' ability to speak up about health and safety. So if I'm in a permanent job where I've got guaranteed hours, I am much more comfortable in raising a health and safety issue, because I have no fear, or less fear, that my hours are going to be cut, or that my work's not going to be there next week. That's not the case for workers in insecure work. And we shouldn't forget, Australia has some of the highest rates of insecure work in the world. We talk about roughly between a quarter and a third of workers are in insecure work, and the definitions are often a bit changeable in terms of how we exactly describe it. But if we think about even just conservatively, 1 in 4 workers that are concerned about raising a health and safety issue and speaking up about health and safety, that impacts not just their health and safety, it impacts all of our health and safety, not just in a physical, but in a psychological sense. But you're absolutely right, Joelle. I mean, when we think about mental health, having a secure job and a secure income and being able to plan your life is so critical to your own well-being. And for so many workers, right through from those that are working largely permanent hours in a casual or labour hire arrangement, right through to workers in gig, that's something that they don't have. And it's something that our movement's been really focused about addressing, because it's a big problem, and it's a problem that is very unique to Australia. It's something that we see much more prevalent in an Australian industry than we do when we look overseas.
Yeah, I didn't realise that the rates were that high in Australia.
Yeah,
very concerning.
Yeah, so insecure work, fair wages, they're kind of like two big ones. And I guess in the US, they probably have bigger issues with not just insecure work, but fair wages as well.
The livable wage. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, absolutely. But even in Australia at the moment, I mean, we only need to look at the cost of living pressures that people are under. Inflation just last month was put at 5%. We were told 2 days ago that the Reserve Bank is projecting that inflation will get up to 6% by the end of this year. And yet our wages are only rising at about 2 to 2.3%. So most workers in this country are taking a really severe pay cut at the moment. In fact, the most significant pay cut they've had since really the Great Depression. So, income security is just as relevant a factor at the moment, especially when we consider that how do workers seek to address that? It might be that they're going to work longer hours, taking on more overtime shifts, things like that, because they've got to pay the bills. That's going to put significant stress, not just on their physical health, but as we all know, longer working hours are often associated with poor mental health as well.
Yeah, now some significant issues that have to be addressed.
Yeah, definitely.
Liam, though, tell us about some of the efforts of unions and workers in the past to drive reform for psych health and safety. There's obviously lots going on, particularly in Australia in this space at the moment with new regs and codes of practice and whatnot. But, tell us directly about some of the involvement of unions.
Yeah, look, I do want to talk about what's happening at the moment, but I think it's important to understand that the union movement has really been a champion of, ensuring workers' mental health for a long time. Now, when I first started at the ACTU, some of the older hands were quick to point out to me, the stress campaigns that unions ran in the 90s and 80s around, the pressures around work and work intensification. And I talked a bit about it before when we think about what does work intensification look like in this century versus last century. And, we know that increasingly there are more jobs that are requiring that sort of high cognitive demands, less routine manual labor that are going to put greater pressure on people's mental health. But unions have always been at the forefront of mental health. When I think about a lot of the campaigns that unions have been successful at around safe staffing levels, deep at the core of that is about physical and mental health and safety, making sure that workers have the resources to perform the tasks that they're required to do, and making sure that things like burnout are issues that are dealt with in an industrial context. But you're right in saying, at the moment we are in the midst of a big reform campaign. And when I came to the ACTU, it was really clear across the movement that there was real unity around the fact that we need to do more around mental health. And when we talk about our work health and safety laws, fundamentally, at a very high level, these laws require employers to ensure the health and safety of workers and others so far as is reasonably practicable. And we have regulations and codes that support that work. But actually, when we dug under the hood, all of those regulations and codes were about the physical health and safety of workers and very little about psychological health. And actually, if you stop the average punter on the street and talk to them about health and safety, it conjures up very blue-collar, masculine images of what health and safety is. And actually, for many workers, that's not the most relevant thing. As I said, we're seeing an increasing number of people in service sector jobs. The changing nature of the Australian workforce means that more workers are moving into those sorts of professions where physical hazards are not going to be the dominant concern for them, but increasingly psychological hazards are. And that's why we've seen this massive explosion of mental health issues happening in workplaces. And even if we just use the sort of very simplistic numbers around workers' compensation, we have seen some of the fastest injury rate growth amongst mental health injuries. Going back sort of 15 to 20 years, they represented about 3 or 4% of our workers' compensation claims. Today, they're pushing upwards above 9%, and they are the fastest growing. And they are also not just fastest growing in terms of their frequency, but also in terms of their severity. A worker who sustains a mental health injury at work takes about 3 times longer to rehabilitate and return to work than they would if they'd sustained a physical injury. And I think for a lot of people, that's quite shocking, that someone could break a bone or do significant physical damage to themselves that requires less time to rehabilitate than a psychological injury is something that I think stands out and shocks a lot of people. I think for most of us that have seen the impacts of work on mental health, it's not surprising at all that it takes that long. But I think increasingly we are seeing this sort of focus around it. So for us as a movement, it was fundamental that we plug some of those gaps. And the first thing we wanted to do was plug the gap in our work health and safety framework around prescriptive standards that require employers to address mental health. And I'm sort of glad to say that we are in the final throes of that, with the work around having a regulation included in our model work health and safety laws. But indeed, we were already seeing some jurisdictions take those steps with a new code of practice and hopefully a regulation due to be implemented in the next 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, no, we've been watching with a lot of interest. Interesting what you say, and it's something that we have spoken about on the podcast before, the where we are at with physical health and safety at the moment versus, where we're at with psychological health and safety. I remember when New South Wales published their code of practice or Safe Work New South Wales published their code of practice for consultation, and they released some of their local workers' compensation statistics. And they showed that over, I think it was a 3 or 4 year period, there was about a 3.5% increase in physical injury claims and over 40% increase in psychological injury claims. So it's a rapidly increasing. And as you say, the complexity of psychological injury claims are much more so than physical. I think it's now about close to half a year off work now for the average psychological injury claim.
26.6 weeks is the average time to return to work. What's interesting, I use workers' compensation statistics, and I really want to stress that is an underestimate of the rate of illness, not just in relation to psychological illness, but injury and illness generally. There's a lot of research out there that shows that workers who are injured at work don't often make a workers' compensation claim. But in particular, when it comes to mental health, they're even less likely to, because there are actually some differences in terms of how a mental injury is dealt with in our workers' compensation laws to our physical health. And the easiest way for me to describe it is that if I walk into my workplace, irrespective of who is at fault, and I fall over and break my arm, it is a no-fault system where my claim is automatically accepted. In the case of my mental health, if my mental health is as a result of what's called reasonable management practice, and for those that are listening, I'm doing the whole inverted commas thing, that is very different. The idea that work can reasonably impact somebody's mental health actually means that quite a significant number of people don't even bother to make a workers' compensation claim. And we do a yearly tracking survey where we survey the Australian workforce for the impact of work on their health. And, we specifically try to hone in on what the rate of injury and illness are in workplaces. And last year we ran the survey and we found that roughly 1 in 3 workers sustained an injury or illness as a result of their work. Disturbingly close to 1 in 5 of those were psychological injuries. Now, some had both, but disproportionately a larger number of people are experiencing poor mental health arising out of their work. So, we think there's a lot of undetected mental health injuries at work that needs to be addressed. But a big problem we've got is our workers' compensation systems don't really fit, the mental health conditions. And as we said before, they're very bad at returning people to work and rehabilitating them. And quite often, someone who sustains a physical injury will go on to sustain a secondary psychological injury, largely because of how difficult our workers' compensation systems are to navigate as well.
Yeah, anecdotally, we've definitely heard that it can be difficult for people to make a workers' compensation claim, even if they want to, for a psychological injury because of the onus of proving that it was primarily work-related. And I guess some other statistics to back up what you're saying is if you look over in the UK, for example, the HSC have their labour force survey every year. And, the latest one showed that about half of all illnesses and injuries sustained at work when self-reported were due to stress, depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
So if you're saying, and we know from Safe Work Australia, the workers' compensation states nationally that about 9 to 10% of all injuries and illnesses are due to mental injuries. But self-reported, it's actually 50%. There's like you say, there's a big discrepancy there.
There's a big gap. And, a lot of that is, to be also fair, a lot of that is also how people think about a mental health injury that's sustained at work. One of the things that we've been doing is we run a project called Mind Your Head, which is all about getting people to see mental health on the same level as they see physical health, both employers, but indeed workers. And more often than not, people see mental health differently. Whilst we've made significant progress in the way in which we talk about mental health in workplaces, I think inevitably mental health is seen as an individual rather than a collective issue. And we're very good at collectively understanding that not being exposed to a physical hazard at work is really important, but we don't necessarily see poor mental health arising out of work as something that, collectively we need to address. And I think often it's sort of put down to individual worker resilience. And there's a lot of, initiatives out there that are working counter to workers understanding that, actually you have the same rights to mentally healthy work as you do physically healthy work, and being able to sort of clock that and recognize the particular hazards that you're exposed to at work.
Yeah, Liam, sounds like you've been having very similar conversations to what we have with workers, regarding that push down to manage the risk, I guess, associated with psychosocial hazards down to individuals and be more resilient, practice better self-care, be more mindful versus thinking systemically what is actually causing this in the first place.
Absolutely.
So I guess you will have seen lots of different practices across sort of employers and in different industry groups and that sort of thing. I'm interested to hear if you have examples of sort of employers and good practice in this area.
Yeah. So I think there's a bit of there's an arc to what I sort of see sort of employer and workplace awareness around mental health. And quite often it sort of goes from a starting off with, we've had instances of poor mental health in the workplace, and there's this sort of immediate need from employers to go and address it. And often that sort of manifests itself in, let's getting some people trained around mental health first aid and those sorts of initiatives. And these are largely about let's immediately deal with the consequences of poor practices in workplaces that give rise to poor mental health. So quite often what we'll see is that's the first initiative that we see employers doing. And again, I think concerningly, this is not necessarily about treating the causes of poor mental health. This is about assisting workers, and it's extremely valuable. Like I don't want to in any way diminish those sorts of initiatives. Having workers and peers who are able to recognize poor mental health and provide assistance is a really critical part to having, a mentally healthy workplace. Generally, they then head on a bit of a journey, which, some people in the sort of mental health space might describe as sort of fruit bowls and yoga, which are sort of well-being initiatives. Again, they are good intention. They are absolutely coming from the right place, but they're not necessarily sort of dealing with the symptoms. And again, this sort of feeds into that sort of narrative that I was talking about before, which is that mental health is seen as this sort of individual resilience thing. And, this is about us sort of toughening you up or making work this sort of more bearable environment for what is fundamentally, a stressful way in which we produce whatever it is the business or organization's there to do. The final step that we really see on that journey, which is something we try to push employers to much quicker, is the framework that we use for physical health and safety, which we say is more than applicable when it comes to mental health. So I talked before about, that duty to ensure health and safety so far as is reasonably practical. That is a legal right that workers have and a legal obligation that employers have. And generally it follows a pretty simple system. Employers have to identify hazards in the workplace. They have to assess the risks that they present to workers and others. and they have to implement controls, and they have to do that in consultation with workers. That system is more than applicable when it comes to mental health. And really what we see as the biggest challenge in workplaces really runs in two different directions. One is there are workplaces that really understand that health and safety framework. And, Joe, we were talking about the offshore space where workers have a really good appreciation of health and safety systems, but might not necessarily have the language and the capability to think about that in the context of mental health. And then there are workplaces that might have that language around mental health, but they lack the work health and safety systems. So the biggest challenge we think we see in workplaces, and where employers are really able to make significant change around that, is by being able to marry those two things up. Having good systems around how you manage health and safety issues in the workplace, but also having good language in the way in which we talk, and a good culture about talking about psychosocial safety at work. So, I'd sort of describe it quite as a spectrum. And I think there's a level of maturity that some organizations are moving to in Australia, where we're now getting to that end of let's really get into and tackle the types of psychosocial hazards that workers are experiencing in the organization. And it could be anything from, exposure to what is increasingly common now and has really been highlighted during the pandemic, that sort of occupational violence and aggression, those sorts of workplaces where that is, overwhelmingly a significant contributor to poor mental health, right through to actually looking at the fundamental, systems of work, rosters, hours of work, safe staffing levels, which are increasingly, as I said before, bearing out on people's mental health more so than their physical health. But I think, I'd sort of describe it as that sort of arc, you sort of workplaces who become aware of it, maybe because there's been a significant issue in the workplace, moving through to how we can actually address it in a sort of systematic sort of way.
Yeah, I'd say that's very consistent with our observations as well, that there is that sort of learning curve of people making a shift from thinking about mental health as an individual clinical problem to actually understanding that there are organisational drivers that contribute to mental health, and that's sort of within our not only our capacity but also our duties to address as employers. So yeah, we definitely see that pattern as well. And what I've found interesting is that organisations that we speak to who do have fairly mature safety management systems, when we start talking in the language of psychosocial hazards and upstream risk management, changing the way that work is done rather than changing the worker, it's sort of a lot easier for them to make that mental switch and actually start to see how systems of work influence mental health, because it sort of aligns with an existing view of work and health, whereas maybe sort of predominantly white collar work workplaces who don't have that mature safety management system really sort of struggle a lot more to make that conceptual shift.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about that is when we think about the impact that how work is organised has on our mental health, actually the upstream changes are much more significant than we probably ever countenanced when it comes to physical health. And I think this is where the future tension is going to be, and how serious some of these employers are to making changes to systems of work. I know you're both in Western Australia, and obviously there are some really significant sort of structural problems with large sections of the workforce over there, in particular in the resource sector. So, some of the key hazards we know to mental health is, things like rosters, things like living remotely. These are things that, in some ways cannot be changed. Like, if you're working on an offshore platform, you are going to be working offshore and we can't change that. But what we can think about is how can we sort of make positive changes in the workplace to reduce the exposure to that, changing rosters, looking at the way in which we provide better amenities offshore so that workers can connect to family. I think these are the sort of more fundamental things which will test the bona fides, quite frankly, of employers around here, which I think, when it comes to physical hazards, there's a commitment, there's a clear line that they're going to change systems of work to address it, a hierarchy of controls, might we say, that says we're going to address these hazards at their source. I'm genuinely curious as to how bona fide some of those bigger employers will be to make sort of wholesale system changes to the way in which work is organised, because as you'd know, the mental health impacts of some of those are really significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's a lot easier to just have, with physical hazards, we know what we need to do if we're putting somebody at height, and we know what we have to do to protect that person from injury or death associated with working at height. Whereas, if everybody has a different tolerance for a workload. So how do we actually know what's a reasonable benchmark for workload? So it becomes a lot more complex when you're talking about mental health impacts associated with work contexts. So it's a
I want to pick up that point, and I know you don't mean it this way, but often that individualizing of how people deal with workloads is often something that we encounter a lot, and we'll find employers will say, oh, well, one person really likes that. They like I can't remember the term. I think it was once put to me, this sort of thriving workplace. And the thriving workplace is something that often gets thrown around as workers want to be stimulated. And that's true. Nobody wants work with sort of, boring, mundane, routine work. You do want some sort of, dynamic work environment. But it comes down to sort of demands and resources. So workers need to have the resources to be able to meet those additional demands. And I think you're right in saying that the impact on the individual will be different, but we need to make sure that there is a sort of risk assessment process where we look at, what is reasonable for a worker to be expected to be performing with the resources that we have provided them. And I think in a physical context, we get that very simply. It's very objective. In a mental health context, it's not so much, and it's something that's much more complex. And that's why we say, fundamentally, the overriding principle that sits within our work health and safety systems is consulting with workers. So actually sitting down and having a conversation with workers about how work is being organised is really critical. And it's even more so when it comes to their psychological health.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that probably a better analogy is, looking at like musculoskeletal exposures. And, Jason can lift something much heavier than I can. Does that mean it's reasonable for my employer to expect me to be able to carry around the same amount of weight that Jason can? Well, no. So I think that's a better analogy than some of the other types of physical hazards that we might think about.
Absolutely.
So what would you say are the main opportunities for improvement at the moment in workplaces?
Well, look, I think it really does come down to those two camps, in my opinion. I'm probably simplifying it a lot because I think there is a bit of a spectrum in terms of the level of maturity of workplace sort of health and safety systems. And I'll be very simplistic about it. So, I'm sure we'll get no doubt comments to say, it's not that binary. But if I think about going back to where I talked about in terms of, health and safety seen as a blue collar thing. So I sort of see that on one level, we have a lot of workplaces that have good health and safety systems, and we're plugging a gap around psychosocial safety. Where I think we'll get the biggest bang for buck is in those workplaces that are not blue collar, that are that don't see health and safety in that same way. Actually building those health and safety systems is really critical. And it's not just critical for your psychological health. You'll see massive benefits from mental health. So for us, it's why we developed our Mind Your Head program, which is really about trying to do both of those things. It is about giving people the language, workers in particular, the language to be able to talk to each other around psychosocial safety, to be able to recognize that you have a collective right to psychologically healthy work in the same way that you do physically healthy work, and that we actually have laws and systems that enable you to participate in decision-making around health and safety. And I think the key thing is recognizing that health and safety is a shared decision-making process. It's not shared responsibility. Employers are responsible for it, but there is a shared decision-making process. So for us, I think what we want to see is, increasing awareness amongst health and safety representatives of psychosocial hazards at the workplace. But more importantly, in those workplaces and sectors where health and safety systems don't exist, trying to help build them up and build them up around psychosocial safety. And so I think those are the two sort of competing demands on unions. And, I think for me, in many respects, what this does is it really opens up health and safety to a much broader audience. So we are really trying to build out a campaign that makes people think about their psychological health in the same way that they do their physical health, and that their rights to safe and healthy work are really fundamental to making sure that we can minimize the rate of mental health injuries and mental health conditions arising out of work.
Yeah, and I think, definitely, we've got industries probably in the media a bit more at the moment, struggling with these challenges for, law, for example, financial institutions, social media, all of these types of industries that, wouldn't typically need a strong physical health and safety management system. But these concepts are becoming a lot more important for them now.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing to realize is that the benefits are significant too. I mean, there's lots of research out there that talks about the investment in mental health and the returns. Like, I can't remember the numbers exactly, so please correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure some of your listeners and viewers will throw it in the chat, but it's something like for every $1 invested in mental health, there's a $2 to $3 return. So the dividend is huge. We did a report going into the sort of psychological health law reform debate about what the annual cost of poor mental health was, and we sort of put a figure at around $16 billion. Like, it is a massive drag on output, both in terms of absenteeism, presenteeism. We talked about the workers' compensation data, and if we look at our workers' compensation schemes across the country, the biggest pressure on them is the psych injury stuff. Like, we talked about the time workers are off. Like, those are, yes, a fraction of the number of people that are injured, but actually, even just that fraction is putting a lot of pressure back on premiums and workers' compensation schemes. There is a real benefit to getting this right. So I think, what's really highlighted again out of the pandemic is that, people really are demanding mentally healthier work. And there's huge opportunities, especially with, a lot of sort of labor mobility at the moment. You want to keep people, you need to make sure work is mentally healthy and safe. And so I think the opportunities there for employers to invest in mental health have never been better. It is the evidence is clear about what it is, what it takes to make work mentally safer, but also the benefits have never been greater in terms of the return, in terms of better productivity.
Yeah, absolutely. Productivity. And even if the only measure you were looking at is turnover, I mean, turnover is expensive. And if you can reduce that by a few percentage points, it's going to be enormous for your business.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but you can understand why, the Productivity Commission inquiry into mental health that was published a couple of years ago, recommended as one of their key recommendations to elevate psychological health and safety to the same level as physical health and safety. The federal government spends close to $10 billion a year on mental health now, and most of that is downstream reactive services.
Absolutely.
Well, we know we'd get much better bang for buck if we went upstream and workplaces started dealing with this more as a safety issue.
Absolutely. Much cheaper to prevent and much better for society as well.
Yeah, it's unsustainable at the moment, that rise in costs that the government is continuing to spend on mental health reactively. But I guess what would be some of the success stories that you've been involved with in improving mental health impacts at work?
Oh, look, I touched briefly about safe staffing levels. I think staffing levels are increasingly becoming what had traditionally been seen as a real industrial campaign, are more and more seen about mental health, making sure that workers have got the resources to do the tasks. And we see this in our caring industries. And right around the country now, we see workers campaigning for safe staffing levels. And I think fundamentally those are health and safety campaigns at their core. There's a fight on in New South Wales at the moment around safe staffing levels for nurses. We've seen, great achievements in Victoria and in Queensland around these sorts of issues in our health and caring professions. Workers overwhelmingly are fighting for, better quality work above and beyond even in the wages crisis that we're in at the moment. Higher wages necessarily. I think people want good, rewarding work, and that means work where they are able to deliver on what they've been set as sort of, jobs. So, overwhelmingly, I'd say safe staffing levels are key campaigns. But also, occupational violence and aggression is a key issue that workers are facing, not just in our health and caring industries, although, those have definitely been at the forefront, but even in retail. And it's been really highlighted by the pandemic. one of our biggest affiliates, the Shop Assistants Union, has been running a campaign for a number of years around having respect for hospitality workers. And that's actually aimed at the community. So it's called No One Deserves a Serve, and it's about making sure that the community treat retail workers with respect. And something that, unfortunately, during the pandemic, retail workers in supermarkets, but also a whole range of other frontline workers in public transport and others really bore the brunt of the public's frustrations. And I think we need to recognise that, these are people's workplaces and that they deserve to be treated fairly and with respect. And, it's something I know unions are campaigning for right across a range of those industries.
Yeah, it didn't take long for Karen from Bunnings, and it became a bit of a meme, but I guess that it kind of typifies like a quite a regular occurrence, too regular occurrence for retail and hospitality workers. Yeah,
I mean, we saw some shocking statistics in Victoria with, and I may get this number wrong as well, it was something like as many as 1 in 5 supermarket workers being coughed or spat on in the first wave of the pandemic. And that's really shocking. And shows a lack of respect towards those workers. So, unions are fighting for those basic things. And we also want to make sure that employers recognise that they have an obligation to protect workers from these sorts of hazards. And, too often, especially during the pandemic, workers were expected to perform tasks that were not, their normal jobs. And that put them, in the firing line of the public. So, I think it's something that, from a union perspective, unions are constantly fighting for mentally healthier work, and definitely occupational violence and aggression has been something that we've been really focused on and trying to win.
Yeah, it's really interesting, this conversation that we're having with you, Liam, because we're clearly talking about stuff that isn't about someone's lack of resilience or they haven't practiced enough mindfulness. These are, working conditions that the employer can do something about.
Absolutely. And I think increasingly more and more jobs are going to be exposed to those types of hazards. So, I talked before about my union and the types of work that I organised, and these were what I'd sort of describe as sort of operator jobs. They run heavy plant and equipment, whether it be in a steel mill or an aluminium smelter, in a mine or so on. The physical hazards are reducing as a part of their work. More and more of their work is being automated, which means more and more of their work is requiring higher cognitive demands. It's less routine. So even if we remove the occupational violence and aggression stuff, which we know is increasing because of the size of the service sector, those jobs are also increasing. Even those, what we might describe as older industry jobs, are changing as well, that more and more mental health hazards are coming in. So I think it's the sort of thing that, we need to have a greater awareness around this stuff. And mindfulness, you're absolutely right. Like that is not the issue here. The issue here is always going to be work intensification, making sure that workers have the resources to be able to deliver on the tasks that they're assigned. And I think increasingly that's coming into question.
Yeah.
So in your view, is there further law reform or awareness that still needs to take place, recognising that we're sort of still waiting on the model regs to be released in draft form?
Yeah, so we still need to win this. Like, this is not a done deal by any stretch, and we need to make sure that we have regulations that are consistent with the way in which we manage physical health and safety. So what we don't want to see is a weak regulation that's introduced that doesn't put the same obligations on employers to identify and manage psychosocial hazards as they would their physical hazards. So, we want to see a regulation that really clearly says that there are better actions that you can take around mental health and lesser actions. So, for the health and safety aficionados out there, in a physical health and safety space, we talk about hierarchies of control. There are better controls and other things. And we talked about mindfulness and those sorts of initiatives. We don't want to see those sort of initiatives being encouraged by regulation. We want to see changes to systems of work. We want to see changes that go upstream. So I would still say this is a very contested space. We've seen the Victorian draft regulation. So bearing in mind, not every state is going to do this the same way, even in the sort of what we'd call the harmonised states. We're already starting to see some deviation, and some states will move to stronger, we think, regulations than others. So, we're going to be working as a movement to try and make sure that we get the best practice put into those regulations. But that isn't the end of it. And you mentioned before, Jason, the Productivity Commission's report. And you're right. Part of that report was about making sure that we put mental health and physical health on the same footing. There was also some key reforms around workers' compensation and how we deal with mental health injuries. And, I talked before about the numerous hurdles that workers have to go through to get a mental health or a stress claim up in our workers' comp statistics. What we know about treating people with poor mental health is the earlier that we intervene and assist them, the quicker they will recover. And it's a big number, like we said, half a year on average. What we want to see is all jurisdictions moving to a provisional liability position when it comes to mental health, which means the minute that a worker puts in a workers' compensation claim, they're automatically getting treatment. We know that that's important in terms of being able to make sure that we can rehabilitate them quicker and return them to work. But it's really critical that they both not get just the medical support, but also the income support, because as you pointed out, income security is such a critical risk around your mental health. So that's a really important initiative. We've seen some states already move that way. Victoria and New South Wales have got some provisional liability schemes. We've seen some pilots run within the Comcare jurisdiction, which show that even the introduction of provisional liability actually it makes the system financially better off because we're returning more workers quicker. So we think that's an initiative that should be done across the board. We think that's really important in terms of tackling mental health in the workplace. So, I would say that is the sort of next frontier, or the area that probably most warrants attention in various jurisdictions. So making sure that all states, bearing in mind workers' compensation schemes are all managed by the states, with the exception of the Comcare scheme, are really critical in terms of how we support workers who are suffering poor mental health caused by their work.
Yeah, that's an excellent point there. The reform to the workers' compensation schemes. I've seen examples of it myself where it's just people end up more injured by sort of trying to deal with compensation providers and workplace representatives of those policies and all of that sort of thing, and they just end up worse than if they'd made no claim at all in the first place.
Yeah, totally. It's look, I will say it's one of the more distressing things is seeing both how workers sustain physical but also psychological injuries at work, and more often than not, our workers' compensation system is contributing to poor mental health. Too often we're seeing workers who sustain a physical injury at work and then go into the workers' compensation system, and the system actually breaks them down, causing mental health issues. So that's something that governments really need to consider reform to, because it is a system that is not empowering workers who are injured, and they are extremely vulnerable.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see it, right? Like you said before, with the physical injury in the workplace, it's kind of like, no burden of proof. It happened in the workplace. Let's get you access to assistance immediately to help you recover. If the same was done for mental health, we could definitely make a huge dent in that half a year off work if people are getting access and put on a treatment plan a lot earlier.
Absolutely.
Yeah, rather than when they're already in a distressed state trying to fight the workers' comp insurer and, all the rest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Liam, it's been a really interesting conversation with you today, mate. And definitely, you're hitting all of the regular talking points that we would hit on a show aimed at more of a health and safety approach to psychological health in the workplace. One question that we ask all of our guests, though, and I'm hoping you can give us a good answer today, is, if you looked into the future, what would your hopes be for the future of workplace mental health?
Well, if I think about the future, to do so, I need to quickly think about the past. And I actually think Australia has a great story to tell when it comes to health and safety. So setting aside the last couple of years, we have seen significant progress when it comes to making sure that work is healthier and safer. So, we still see 200 workers a year killed on average. We still see 5,000 workers die from diseases caused by their work. And 100,000, close to 120,000 now, seriously injured at work. Despite those pretty big numbers, those are tracking down and have tracked down consistently for the better part of 20 years. And that's because we've really developed these mature, safe systems of work in the areas where we need to do it. So in those, industries where physical hazards dominate, where physical injuries and indeed death were really prevalent, we built worker-led health and safety, and we're able to reduce exposure to hazards and therefore reduce the rates of injury and death. I am confident that we can do the same when it comes to psychological hazards. The problem has been getting lawmakers on the same page to plug the gaps in our law. And we are hopefully at the end stages of that. Our movement is absolutely gearing up to use those new rights. A big part of that project that I talked to you about is actually about skilling up trade unions and workplace activists to be able to talk to their colleagues about mental health, to be able to use these new rights to identify and control psychosocial hazards, because that's the way in which we'll do it. So I do think that the future is bright when it comes to reducing the rate of mental health injuries in workplaces. I think it requires employers and workers to work together in the same way that we have in terms of reducing the rates of physical injuries, deploying those efforts towards mental health.
Yeah, terrific. It'd be a great future if we can do that.
Indeed. So Liam, the final question that we have for you today is, do you have any words of advice for listeners who would like to work in the area of psych health and safety?
Well, look, I would say it is a growing field. The numbers that we've talked about throughout this podcast sort of give rise to the fact that investment from employers in mental health is absolutely going to return dividends. And I think the one parting word I'd have for anyone who is either wanting to work in psychological health and safety or indeed is already there is that recognizing that workers understand their work better than anybody else, and that primary obligation on employers to consult with workers and their representatives is really critical in terms of organizing safer work, in particular mentally safe work. So, I'm sort of encouraged by the fact that there's a lot of discussion around mental health across the community, but specifically people like yourselves that are really focusing it around workplaces, because we should remember that work is a really positive influence on our mental health. I've spent a lot of time today talking about the negative consequences of poor work, but we all know that it's a fundamental part of who we are. It's essential to workers' dignity and a decent life. And we want to make sure that as much as possible, work is minimizing exposure to psychosocial hazards and providing those positive factors in workers' lives. So I think it is an area which is going to be growing, not just because of the economics that we talked about, but because I think more and more people are appreciating the importance of good and decent work.
Yeah, good work is good for you is one of our catchphrases, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Good.
Liam, thank you so much for your time today. It has been a really great discussion, and it's amazing the work that you guys are doing through the union to, I guess, encourage change at the highest levels within Australia. So continue fighting the good fight, mate. You're doing a great job.
Great, and thank you, and thanks to you as well. I think these sort of podcasts are fantastic in getting people to do exactly what we're trying to do, which is to think about their right to mentally safe work. And I think it's the sort of thing that the more of us that are pushing on that right, the quicker we'll be able to get to the other side.
Yeah, hear. Well, Liam, again, thanks for your time today, mate. Listeners, that brings us to the end of today's episode. So just remember, we do record these over Zoom when we're interviewing our guests. So you'll be able to catch the video, if you like, on the FlourishDX YouTube page. We'll also publish some clips from the video on our FlourishDX LinkedIn page. So check that out if you want to see some of the highlights from this and other episodes. And then while you're over on LinkedIn, do drop in and have a chat with Joelle or myself if you want to continue the conversation. And you can also probably reach out to Liam at the ACTU or the ACTU if you'd like to have some more information or advice from them. But that brings us to the end. Thanks, listeners. We'll catch you next episode.